The Cold War was a conflict measured in shades of grey and pulses of energy. It was fought not in trenches, but in the silent, air-conditioned rooms of listening posts and the sterile, vacuum-sealed bays of satellites orbiting high above the Earth. By the mid-1980s, this silent war had reached a fever pitch. The Soviet Union, under a new and enigmatic generation of leadership, was a sphinx, its intentions hidden behind a wall of secrecy and paranoia. NATO's eyes were fixed on the usual suspects, the intercontinental ballistic missile silos scattered across the Kazakh steppe, the sprawling naval bases of the Northern Fleet on the Kola Peninsula, the production facilities for the new T-80 tanks deep in the Urals. The job of watching these targets fell to a small, dedicated army of analysts, most of them based in anonymous office blocks in places like Langley, Virginia, or Raff Molesworth in the UK. Their world was one of photographic film, signals intercepts, and, increasingly, the nascent technology of digital thermal imaging. They were the high priests of a new religion, interpreting the grainy, pixelated gospels delivered by billion-dollar machines in the sky. One of the most monotonous, yet critical, tasks was the routine survey of non-priority areas. Vast swathes of the Soviet Union, particularly in the northern latitudes, were considered empty, frozen wastelands. But doctrine demanded they be checked, if only to confirm their continued emptiness. It was a duty often assigned to junior analysts, a form of hazing, a way to build patience and an eye for detail. You had to prove you could find nothing before you were trusted to find something. It was in this context that a young U.S. Air Force lieutenant named David Shaw found himself staring at a satellite pass over the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The date was January 18, 1987. Outside the analysis center, it was a typical Washington, D.C. winter day, gray and damp. But on Shaw's screen, it was a different kind of winter altogether. The landscape was a monochrome tapestry of brutal cold. The coniferous forests were a deep, absorbent black on the infrared spectrum, the snow-covered clearings a slightly lighter gray. And there, in the middle of it all, was Lake Kepojavi. The file on Kepojavi was thinner than a diplomat's promise. It was a body of water roughly 12 square kilometers in surface area, frozen solid for at least 8 months of the year. No roads led to it. The nearest rail line was over 200 kilometers away. Its name, roughly translated from a local Finno-Ugric dialect, meant Lake of the Silent Pine. It was, by every metric in the NATO intelligence database, the most boring place on Earth. Shaw's task was to confirm its continued boringness. He was to look for signs of construction, vehicle tracks, heat signatures, anything that might suggest the Soviets were up to something in this frozen nowhere. He expected to see exactly what the satellite's predecessors had seen for decades, a flat, uniformly cold sheet of ice, a perfect negative image of the surrounding forest. But that's not what he saw. The lake was glowing, not with light, but with heat. On the thermal display, which rendered temperature in a spectrum from black, cold, to white, hot, Lake Kepojavi was a ghostly, pale gray shape, starkly contrasted against the pitch black of the frozen forest. It was warm, not tropical warm, but significantly warmer than its surroundings. In the ambient air temperature of -30 degrees Celsius, the lake's surface was reading a physically impossible -8 degrees. Shaw leaned closer, his brow furrowed. He tapped the screen. "Hey, Jerry," he called to the analyst at the next terminal. "You ever see a lake do this?" Jerry Kovacs, a veteran of 20 years in photo interpretation, swiveled his chair. He peered at Shaw's monitor, his expression one of mild curiosity that quickly hardened into professional skepticism. "Sensor ghost. Happens when the bird's optics get a blast of direct sunlight off the ice. It's an artifact. It's 3 in the afternoon local time. The sun's barely above the horizon. And look at the pattern," Shaw insisted, using a light pen to circle the anomaly. "It's not a glare. It's even. The whole lake is consistently warm." Kovacs frowned. "Run a diagnostic on the KH-11's thermal array. And pull the last pass from last week. Probably a processing error." Shaw did as he was told. The satellite's systems reported no malfunctions. The previous week's imagery, taken under similar weather conditions, showed the same thing. A lake that stubbornly refused to freeze as hard as everything around it. It was a tiny, thermal pimple on the vast, frozen face of northern Karelia. The human mind, especially one trained in intelligence, is a pattern recognition machine, but it is also a machine built on precedent. It seeks to fit new data into existing boxes. A warm lake. It had to be a mistake. The satellite, codenamed Keyhole, was a technological marvel, but it was not infallible. Its senses could be fooled by atmospheric conditions, by a freak weather phenomenon known as a temperature inversion, or by a simple software glitch in the ground processing station at Fort Beaver. "It has to be an error," Kovacs concluded, the finality in his voice signaling the end of the discussion. "Flag it for the next calibration cycle and move on. We've got real targets to look at in the Kola Peninsula." But David Shaw was stubborn. He was a physicist by training before being recruited into the Air Force, and the anomaly nagged at him. Lakes don't stay warm in -30 degrees Celsius. Water has a high specific heat capacity, yes, but not that high. Not without a source of energy. It defied the laws of thermodynamics. Quietly, after his shift, he retasked the satellite. It was a minor abuse of his clearance, a bureaucratic sin, but he had to know. 2 days later, the new data arrived. Pass number 2. The result was the same. The lake was warm, but this time, with a clearer atmospheric window and a slightly different orbital angle, he saw more. The warmth wasn't perfectly uniform. There were patterns, faint, grid-like lines of slightly higher temperature, like the ghost of a tic-tac-toe board etched in thermal energy onto the ice, and in the center of the lake, a slightly more intense, diffuse glow. He ran the images through an enhancement algorithm, a slow, grinding process on the room-sized computers of the era. The pixels resolved. The grid patterns became clearer. They were too regular, too geometric to be natural. They didn't look like cracks in the ice or patterns of snowdrift. They looked like ventilation. The thought was absurd. It was a lake, a frozen one, in the middle of nowhere. He brought the enhanced images to his supervisor, a CIA desk man named Alistair Crowe, a man whose cynicism was as finely honed as his analytical skills. Crowe listened patiently, steepling his fingers, as Shaw laid out his evidence. "Sir, I know how it sounds, but look at the thermal signature. It's consistent across multiple passes. The grid pattern here, it corresponds to no known geological feature. And this central anomaly, it's pulsating, very slightly, a fraction of a degree every 6 hours. It's a cycle." Crowe examined the prints, his face impassive. He had seen 1,000 wild theories from junior analysts, secret bases on the dark side of the moon, missile silos disguised as barns. 99.9% were garbage. But he was a professional, and his job was to sift through the garbage for the one diamond. "A cycle," he repeated, his voice flat. "Like a heating system on a timer, sir. Or air exchange. For a large, enclosed space." Crowe was silent for a long time, staring at the ghostly image of the warm lake. He thought about the sheer, audacious improbability of it, and then he thought about the Soviets, their love of monumental, hidden engineering. The Metro 2 secret subway system under Moscow. The enormous underground submarine pens. They didn't think small, and they had a pathological love of secrecy. He finally looked up at Shaw, his eyes narrowed. "All right, Lieutenant, you've got my attention, but if this is a glitch, I'm having you transferred to weather balloon duty in Thule." He picked up his secure phone. "I'm retasking a big bird. We're going to get a radar map of that lake bed, and I want every signals intelligence weasel at NSA listening for any electronic whisper coming from that grid square." He hung up and looked back at the image, a deep frown on his face. He finally said the words that would set in motion a multi-billion-dollar intelligence investigation, words that no one in NATO had ever expected to utter in relation to a forgotten lake in Karelia. "This looks like an underground structure." The fisherman's name was Yuri Volkov, and he was a man of the old ways, a holdover from a time before the collective farms and the 5-year plans. He knew Lake Kepojavi not as a set of coordinates on a map, but as a living entity, with its moods, its secrets, and its generous, silver-scaled trout. It was this deep, ancestral knowledge that made the events of that morning so profoundly unsettling. He had been out before dawn, his small, wooden lodka cutting a silent path through the pre-dawn gloom. The air was so cold it felt solid in his lungs. He used a hand-cranked auger to drill through 3 feet of ice, the sound of the cutting blade a sharp, grinding protest in the immense silence. He'd set his lines, baited with scraps of salted pork, and settled into wait, a thermos of sweet, strong tea his only comfort against the deepening cold. The first sign was a sound. Not from above, but from below. A low, resonant thrum, like a massive, submerged bell being struck. It was a vibration he felt through the soles of his felt-lined boots more than he heard with his ears. The ice beneath him transmitted the sound, a deep bass note that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. He froze, his thermos halfway to his lips. He knew every sound the lake made, the groan of expanding ice, the sharp crack of a thermal fissure, the skittering of a fox on the far shore. This was none of those. This was industrial. Then came the vibrations. Gentle at first, a subtle rocking that made the surface of his tea quiver. Then stronger, a rhythmic pulsing that made the ice-encrusted fishing lines dance in their holes. His boat, usually a stable platform, began to shudder, its wooden frame creaking in protest. It felt, he would later try to explain, as if a giant were walking on the bottom of the lake. Terrified, his rational mind grasping for an explanation his instincts already rejected, Yuri did what any sensible man would do. He grabbed his portable radio, a battered Soviet-made Vifovka, and tried to raise the nearest authorities at the forestry station in Murmansk, 50 kilometers away. Slush 8. Slush 8. His voice crackled over the airwaves, laced with a panic that the weak signal couldn't mask. This is Volkov on Kepojave. The lake. It is making noises, metal sounds, like machinery, and the water. It is shaking my boat. Something is under the ice. Something big. The response from the forestry station was a study in bored Soviet bureaucracy. Comrade Volkov, you are probably hearing ice shift, or a seismic event. Return to shore. Do not cause alarm. This is not ice. Yuri insisted, his voice rising. I have fished this lake for 40 years. This is metal. This is engines. The exchange was brief, frustrating, and for the forestry official, utterly forgettable. Just another superstitious old man hearing things in the wilderness. The official logged the callers, citizen report, unverified acoustic phenomenon, likely geological, and thought no more of it. But 1,000 miles to the west, in a windowless building at Raff Menworth Hill in England, a different set of ears was listening. The men and women of the NSA's eavesdropping operation, known as Echelon, vacuumed up millions of electronic communications every hour, from diplomatic cables to military traffic to civilian radio chatter. Their computers, programmed with a lexicon of keywords, flagged Yuri's transmission instantly. The keywords were simple: lake, metal sounds, under the ice, vibrations. The transcript, translated from Russian, landed on Alistair Crow's desk within the hour, right next to David Shaw's enhanced thermal imagery. Crow read the fisherman's frantic words. He looked at the ghostly thermal grid on the lake, and a cold, professional excitement, entirely separate from human fear, settled over him. The two pieces of the puzzle, one high-tech and one profoundly human, fit together perfectly. They're not just warming the lake, Crow murmured to Shaw, who stood nervously before his desk. They're running machinery down there. Big machinery. And it's causing enough of a resonance to be felt on the surface. The idea was no longer insane. It was terrifyingly plausible. This was the Cold War. The Soviets had built the Severodvinsk submarine base, a city carved from granite. They had constructed the Duga radar array, a steel forest so large it disrupted global radio communications. Hiding a base under a frozen lake was not just possible, it was, in its own brutal, logical way, brilliant. The ice and water provided a perfect, multi-meter thick layer of natural camouflage and protection from conventional attack. The remoteness guaranteed secrecy. The lake itself could be used as a heat sink, dissipating the thermal signature of a large facility, though clearly not perfectly. But what was it for? Crow assembled a small, hand-picked team of analysts, a brain trust, sequestered in a secure briefing room known as the Vault. For 72 hours, they lived on coffee and cold pizza, brainstorming. It's a communications nexus, one analyst suggested. Extremely low-frequency transmitters for communicating with ballistic missile submarines under the Arctic ice. The water would be a perfect medium. The vibrations the fishermen felt could be from the massive electrical generators needed to power the antenna arrays. Or it's a storage facility, argued another. A hidden cache for tactical nuclear weapons, or chemical agents. Buried under a lake, it's virtually invulnerable to a first strike. The thermal signature could be from environmental control systems, keeping the warheads at a stable temperature. A third, more audacious theory was put forward. What if it's a test facility? Some new kind of propulsion, or a deep submergence vehicle? The lake is deep and isolated. They could be testing something they don't want us to see, something that produces a unique thermal and acoustic signature. The most chilling possibility came from a quiet, older analyst who had spent his career studying Soviet military doctrine. It could be a Zaslon, he said, using the Russian word for barrier, or shield. A forward command post for a new kind of warfare. From there, they could coordinate a limited conflict in the Nordic region without triggering a full nuclear exchange. It's the perfect location, close enough to the Norwegian border and the GI-UK gap to be strategically vital, yet hidden in plain sight. NATO had to know. The potential strategic implications were staggering. Thus was born Operation Icebreaker. Its mandate was simple, its execution fiendishly difficult: positively identify the nature of the facility beneath Lake Kepojave. Spy planes, like the legendary State Route 71 Blackbird, were immediately ruled out. A supersonic pass over an ostensibly empty lake would be a glaring signal to Soviet air defense, alerting them that NATO had discovered their secret. It was the equivalent of shining a spotlight on the one thing you were trying to keep in the shadows. Ground infiltration by special forces was considered and rejected as a near-certain suicide mission. The area, while remote, was known to be patrolled by specialized KGB border troops. The sheer difficulty of inserting a team, their survival in the brutal Arctic winter, and their ability to conduct a meaningful survey of a submerged facility made the risk astronomically higher than the potential reward. They needed a method that was standoff, passive, and undetectable. They needed to listen to the Earth itself. The solution came from an unexpected corner of geophysical science: magnetometry. The Earth has a magnetic field, a predictable pattern of flux lines that can be measured with exquisite sensitivity. But large concentrations of ferrous metals, like the steel used in the construction of buildings, submarines, or power generators, create local distortions in this field. These distortions are called magnetic anomalies. By mapping these anomalies with a magnetometer, you can, in effect, see the shape of hidden metal objects. The technology was not new. It had been used for decades in mineral prospecting and to locate shipwrecks. But applying it on this scale, from a moving platform high above the ground, to pinpoint a secret underground base, was unprecedented. The platform chosen was a modified RC-135U, combat-sent, electronic intelligence aircraft. Stripped of its usual suite of signal intercept antennas, it was fitted with a massive, ultra-sensitive cesium vapor magnetometer housed in a long, streamlined boom extending from its tail, far from the magnetic interference of the aircraft's own engines and frame. The mission profile was a work of art in deception. The RC-135 would fly a seemingly routine patrol along the edge of international airspace off the Kola Peninsula, a flight path the Soviets were accustomed to seeing. Then, on a pre-planned signal, it would divert slightly inland, just for a few minutes, on the pretext of investigating anomalous radar returns. It was a thin cover, but it was all they had. On a crystal clear day in February 1987, the aircraft, call sign, Frostbite 1, made its run. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The crew were veterans, but they knew they were dancing on the edge of a knife. Soviet MiG-31 interceptors were already climbing to shadow them. The pilot held the big 4-engine jet steady as a rock as the sensor operator, a young petty officer named Lisa Reynolds, monitored the magnetometer's output. The initial baseline over the frozen Tiger was a steady, predictable squiggle on her screen, the heartbeat of the planet. Then, as they crossed the western shoreline of Lake Kepojavi, the line jumped. It didn't just waver, it went wild. The needle slammed against the far side of the graph paper. The digital readout scrolled a string of numbers that made no sense. The anomaly was not a small blip, not the signature of a single structure. It was a massive, sprawling distortion that covered almost the entire lake bed. The shape was complex, a labyrinth of sharp peaks and deep troughs indicating a vast, multi-level complex of interconnected steel structures. Reynolds's first, professional instinct was disbelief. Malfunction. We've got a sensor malfunction. She called out over the intercom. The mission commander, our Air Force colonel, leaned over her shoulder. Run a diagnostic. Now. Her fingers flew over the console. All systems reported green. The magnetometer was functioning perfectly. She reset the calibration and ran the data again. The result was the same. The lake was sitting on top of a magnetic field so powerful and complex it dwarfed the signatures of known Soviet installations, including their largest submarine pens. It's not a building, Colonel, Reynolds said, her voice hushed with awe and a touch of fear. She pointed to the screen, to the sprawling, chaotic pattern. It's a city. The colonel stared at the data, his face pale. He keyed his microphone, his voice tight. Frostbite 1 to home plate. Icebreaker is a success. We have positive confirmation. He took a deep breath, the implications settling on him like a physical weight. The magnetic anomaly is bigger than any known Soviet bunker. I repeat, bigger than any known bunker. This isn't a facility. It's an entire underground complex. The magnetometric data was a tectonic shock within the upper echelons of NATO intelligence. The thermal anomaly had been a curiosity, the fisherman's report, a tantalizing clue. But the magnetic signature was irrefutable, physical proof. There was not just a structure under Lake Kepojavi, there was a veritable underground city of steel, a complex of such scale and sophistication that it defied immediate comprehension. The initial theories of a communications relay or a simple storage bunker were instantly rendered obsolete. This was something far grander, far more menacing. Alistair Crow's Brain Trust was now a permanent, high-priority cell, its security clearance elevated to an almost mythical level, known only by its cryptonym, Frostfall. Their new task was to answer the single, burning question, what was the purpose of all that steel? The sheer mass of metal suggested machinery on an industrial scale. Power generators, certainly. Environmental controls. But also, perhaps, something that moved. The fisherman's report of metal sounds and vibrations took on a new, more sinister significance. It wasn't just the hum of generators, it was the sound of something massive in motion. This line of thinking led to the most audacious, and logically terrifying, hypothesis yet: what if the complex was naval? The idea seemed preposterous on its face. Lake Kepojavi was landlocked, over 100 kilometers from the nearest salt water, the White Sea. It was a freshwater lake, frozen solid for most of the year, with no navigable rivers connecting it to the ocean. The notion of basing submarines there was the stuff of science fiction. But the Cold War had a habit of turning science fiction into terrifying reality. Both sides had pursued projects that would have seemed ludicrous a generation earlier. The Soviets, in particular, had a proven track record of monumental, almost inhuman, engineering feats. They had built the Typhoon-class submarines, the largest ever constructed, capable of lurking under the Arctic ice for months. They had dug deep underground shelters for their entire leadership. A hidden submarine base, safe from NATO's hunter-killer submarines and satellite surveillance, would be a strategic masterstroke. To prove it, they needed to listen. Not to radio waves, but to the sounds carried through the water itself. Water is an excellent conductor of sound, far better than air. The low-frequency hum of a submarine's nuclear reactor, the whine of its turbines, the distinctive cavitation of its propeller, these were acoustic fingerprints that could be identified with absolute certainty. This led to Operation ICEBREAKER's most delicate phase, the deployment of a passive acoustic monitoring system. Spy planes were out of the question. Surface ships were impossible. The only solution was to plant a listening device directly in the lake, a device that could operate autonomously, undetected, and survive the brutal Arctic conditions. The weapon of choice was the WSQ-11, a device so classified that most of the personnel who built it didn't know its ultimate purpose. To any observer, it was a chunk of ice, a perfectly crafted, buoyant iceberg mimic, complete with a convincing, wind-sculpted profile and a surface that reflected radar exactly like pack ice. Inside this frozen shell was a technological marvel, a hydrophone array of breathtaking sensitivity, capable of discriminating between the groan of shifting ice and the machined precision of a turbine bearing from 50 miles away. It contained a solid-state recording device with enough capacity for months of continuous audio, and a burst transmitter, designed to fire its collected data in a compressed, millisecond-long radio burst to a passing satellite, a signal so brief and faint it was virtually indistinguishable from cosmic background noise. Deploying it was the problem. A parachute drop was too risky, the impact could damage the sensitive electronics, and the parachute itself would be a glaring signature. The solution was a masterpiece of clandestine aviation. A specially modified U-2 spy plane, flying at the very edge of space, would release the buoy over the Barents Sea. The device would drift with the southbound currents, its journey meticulously calculated to bring it aground, as if by natural forces, on the northern shore of Lake Kepojavi. It was a plan that relied on a profound understanding of oceanography and a hefty dose of luck. For 3 weeks, the FROSTFALL team waited in an agony of suspense. Satellite tracking confirmed the buoy had made landfall within the projected zone. Now, they had to hope the Soviets would dismiss it as a piece of Arctic drift ice, and that its internal mechanisms would survive the journey. The scheduled data burst window came and went. Nothing. A sense of grim failure began to set in. The ice mimic had likely been crushed, or its electronics had frozen solid. Then, 72 hours later, the signal arrived. A sharp, digital squawk picked up by a geosynchronous RHYOLITE signals intelligence satellite. The data was fragmented, corrupted by the extreme cold, but it was there. The audio files, once decrypted and processed, were sent to the U.S. Navy's Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut, the world's foremost authority on the acoustic signatures of seaborne vessels. The chief analyst there was Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who could identify a submarine's class by the unique rhythmic ping of its coolant pumps. The initial hours of the recording were a symphony of natural sounds, the long, low-frequency moans of the ice sheet, the sharp crack of fracturing pressure ridges, the almost musical chirps of seals. Then, the analysts found it, buried deep in the sonic landscape, a sound so out of place it seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was a low, pervasive, resonant hum, a sound with the steady, unwavering frequency of a finely tuned industrial machine. It pulsed with a rhythm that was unmistakably artificial. Thorne and his team isolated the sound, filtered out the background noise, and amplified it. The room full of seasoned acoustical engineers fell silent. "It's a turbine," Thorne said flatly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "A marine turbine. A big one." He pulled up a spectral analysis on the main screen, comparing the unknown sound to a library of known signatures. The frequency bands, the harmonic distortions, the telltale vibration patterns. The computer flagged a match with a 94.7% probability. The match was to the power plant of a Sierra-class Soviet attack submarine. A wave of cold disbelief washed over the FROSTFALL team when the report reached them. The impossible was now confirmed. The Soviets hadn't just built a base under the lake, they had built a submarine pen. There were submarines, nuclear-powered attack submarines, lurking under the ice of a landlocked lake. The implications were staggering. How did they get there? How did they leave? The answer, once they allowed themselves to think the unthinkable, became terrifyingly clear. Tunnels, David Shaw said, the word hanging in the secure briefing room. He walked to a large-scale geological survey map of the Karelian region. "Look at the topology. The watershed. Lake Kepojavi is here. The White Sea is here. His finger traced a path through the ancient, granite bedrock. The distance is over 100 kilometers, but the geology is stable. Pre-Cambrian shield. They could have done it. They could have dug a channel. A submerged, pressurized tunnel, wide enough and deep enough to accommodate a submarine. It was an engineering project of pharaonic ambition. To bore a water-filled tunnel of that length, to reinforce it against immense pressure, to create lock systems and de-icing mechanisms to prevent it from freezing shut, the cost in rubles and human lives must have been astronomical. But it explained everything. It explained how submarines could come and go undetected. It explained the massive thermal signature. The heat from the subterranean base and the tunnel's own environmental systems was warming the lake from below. It explained the vast magnetic anomaly, the sheer amount of steel used in the tunnel's lining, the pen's construction, the support machinery. This was no mere shelter. It was a lair, a hidden base where the Soviet Navy's most advanced and dangerous attack submarines could be stationed in complete secrecy, immune from NATO's relentless underwater surveillance network, the SOS-US arrays. From this inland sea, these ghost boats could slip out into the White Sea, and from there, into the GIUK Gap, the crucial choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom through which all Soviet submarines had to pass to reach the open Atlantic. They could bypass the entire NATO early warning system. They could be lurking off the coast of New York or in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic without anyone ever knowing they had left their home port. The discovery redefined the entire strategic picture of the Cold War. The balance of power in the North Atlantic, a balance meticulously maintained for decades, had just been subtly, catastrophically, tilted. NATO had been watching the known submarine bases at Polyarny and Severodvinsk, counting boats as they left. They now realized they had been counting only a fraction of the threat. An entire, hidden fleet, operating from a base they had never known existed, could be already at sea. The confirmation of a hidden submarine base was a tectonic shift in the Cold War's strategic calculus. But for the analysts of the FROSTFALL cell, a profound and unsettling question remained: how had the Soviets, masters of secrecy and deception, made such a catastrophic error? How had a project of such monumental scale and importance, buried under a frozen lake and accessed by a 100-kilometer-long underwater tunnel, been betrayed? The answer, it turned out, was not to be found in the shadowy world of spies and defectors, but in the mundane, almost laughable, realm of engineering oversight and bureaucratic inertia. The key lay in the very first clue, the thermal anomaly. For weeks, the team had been operating under the assumption that the heat signature was an unavoidable byproduct of the base's operation. But as they delved deeper, cross-referencing the thermal data with the acoustic and magnetic intelligence, a more precise picture began to emerge. The heat wasn't just a constant, ambient warmth. It pulsed. It had a specific, irregular rhythm that correlated with nothing in the base's suspected daily routine. David Shaw, whose stubbornness had initiated the entire investigation, became obsessed with the thermal patterns. He spent days hunched over light tables, comparing the LakeHow signatures with thermal images of known Soviet installations, steel mills, power plants, even the surface signatures of the ballistic missile submarines in port. The LakeHow signature was different. It was less a steady-state emission and more a series of sharp, intense thermal spikes. It's not just waste heat from life support or general operations, he argued to a skeptical Crow. Look at the timing. These spikes occur at irregular intervals, sometimes days apart. They last for several hours, and then the lake's surface temperature drops back to a lower, but still elevated, baseline. It's like they're periodically turning on a massive oven down there. This observation triggered a new line of inquiry. The FROSTFALL team, now with virtually unlimited resources, began a forensic analysis of Soviet engineering and procurement records, a mountain of data painstakingly acquired by the CIA over decades. They looked for anomalies, massive orders for specialized cooling systems, heat exchangers, or power transmission equipment that couldn't be accounted for by known projects. What they found was not an order for something, but a conspicuous lack of an order. The projected heat output of a facility large enough to house and service multiple Sierra-class submarines would be enormous, requiring a massive, dedicated heat dissipation system. The kind of industrial-scale cooling towers or seawater heat exchangers used at naval bases like Severodvinsk would be impossible to hide at LakeHow. The evidence suggested the Soviet engineers had chosen a different, more audacious solution. They would use the lake itself as a giant, natural heat sink. This was a calculated risk, one born of a fundamental, and ultimately fatal, misjudgment. To understand their error, one must step into the mindset of the Soviet military-industrial complex of the late 1970s, when Zavod LakeHow, factory LakeHow, was likely under construction. The project was a crown jewel of the Soviet Northern Fleet, a pet project of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the architect of the modern Soviet Navy. Its security was paramount. The location was chosen precisely because it was beyond the prying eyes of NATO's existing intelligence-gathering capabilities. Their security assessment, which was later partially reconstructed from the notes of a disillusioned KGB archivist, revealed a critical blind spot. The planners were rightly confident against traditional espionage. The area was sealed. They were confident against optical satellite reconnaissance. The lake's frozen surface revealed nothing. They were even confident against early-generation thermal imaging satellites, which had poor resolution and were easily fooled by atmospheric conditions, snow cover, and the simple fact that everything in the Arctic was, to some degree, a variation of cold. The Soviet engineers knew their base would produce heat. Their solution was to run the superheated coolant from the submarine reactors and the base's power generators through a network of pipes laid across the lake bed. The theory was simple: the immense mass of near-freezing water would absorb the heat, dissipating it slowly and evenly. The thermal plume, they calculated, would be too diffuse, too blended with the natural background, to be detected by the American KH-8 and KH-9 satellites then in operation. It was a gamble, but based on the technology of the time, it was a sound one. Their fatal mistake was one of bureaucratic and technological arrogance. They failed to adequately account for the relentless pace of American innovation. The base's final design and its heat dissipation system was signed off in 1978. Construction, a Herculean effort involving tens of thousands of Zeks from the Gulag system, took nearly a decade. During that decade, while Soviet engineers were pouring concrete and laying pipe in the eternal darkness beneath the lake, American aerospace corporations in Sunnyvale and Los Angeles were making quantum leaps in sensor technology. The new KH-11, KEN-N, satellite, the first to use digital imaging and real-time data transmission, was a revolution. But it was its thermal imaging system that was the true game-changer. It employed a new generation of Stirling cycle coolers that allowed its sensors to operate at unprecedented levels of sensitivity and resolution. It could detect temperature variations of a fraction of a degree Celsius from hundreds of miles in space, and its advanced algorithms could filter out atmospheric noise with an efficiency its predecessors could only dream of. The first KH-11 became operational in 1980. By the time Zavad Kepojavi was fully operational and its submarines began running their power-up and turbine tests in the mid-1980s, the eyes in the sky had changed. The Soviets were still looking up, confident they were hidden behind the veil of their own ingenuity in the Arctic winter. They did not realize the veil had been torn away. The thermal spikes David Shaw had identified with a smoking gun. They weren't from the base's daily operation. They were the result of specific, high-power activities. When a submarine's reactor was brought online for testing, or when its turbines were run up to full power while still docked in its pen, it produced a tremendous, concentrated burst of waste heat. The lake's cooling system, designed for the steady-state output of a dormant base, was overwhelmed. For those few hours, the pipes on the lake bed would superheat the surrounding water, sending a distinct, concentrated thermal plume rising to the surface, where it melted the ice from below in those telltale grid patterns. The Soviet engineers, safe in their subterranean fortress, never knew. Their own internal monitoring would have shown the heat was being successfully dumped into the lake. They had no reason to suspect that the new American satellites could see the faint, ghostly signature of their carelessness glowing against the frozen canvas of the Karelian wilderness. It was a failure of imagination. They had built a fortress to withstand the weapons of the last war, while their enemy had developed a new way of seeing. The final, bitter irony was that the base's ultimate secret wasn't betrayed by a traitor or a compromised cipher. It wasn't revealed by a daring reconnaissance flight or a slip of the tongue in the Politburo. The USSR's most secret base, a project that had consumed billions of rubles and countless lives, was undone by the most banal of failures: poor thermal management. It was a catastrophic, multi-billion ruble strategic blunder, hidden in plain sight, all because someone, a decade earlier, had signed off on a heat dissipation system that was merely good enough for the technology of the day. They had been betrayed not by their enemies, but by their own outdated assumptions. The might of the Soviet Northern Fleet had been compromised not by a spy, but by a lack of insulation. The discovery of Zavad Kepojavi sent shockwaves through the inner sanctums of NATO power. It was an intelligence coup of the highest order, but one that could not be celebrated publicly. The very existence of the base was a secret that had to be protected with even greater zeal than the effort used to uncover it. To reveal the discovery would be to reveal the capabilities of the KH-11 satellite, a secret more valuable than the location of a dozen hidden bases. The Cold War was a poker game played with global stakes, and NATO had just peeked at the Soviets' whole card. The trick now was to use that knowledge without letting them know they had been seen. Operation Icebreaker transitioned from a search mission to a surveillance operation of unparalleled intensity, codenamed Vigilant Sentry. The resources allocated were staggering. KH-11 satellite passes over northern Karelia were tripled, their orbits subtly tweaked to maximize coverage of the lake without creating an obvious pattern. The RC-135U, combat scent, aircraft began making its routine patrols with metronomic regularity, its magnetometer tracing and retracing the magnetic ghost of the base beneath the ice. The NSA focused its vast electronic ears on the region, listening for any whisper of communication, any leak of electronic emissions that might escape the subterranean fortress. Most crucially, a network of a dozen next-generation and WSQ-11 buoys, smaller, stealthier, and with even greater acoustic sensitivity, were deployed around the periphery of Lake Kepojavi. They were no longer passive listeners, they were an active, networked sonar fence, creating a detailed acoustic picture of everything that moved beneath the ice. They tracked the comings and goings of what they designated hostile sub 1, 2, and 3. They mapped the daily rhythms of the base, the surge of power every 6 hours coinciding with shift changes, the weekly spike in activity that suggested resupply, the distinct, low-frequency thrum that analysts dubbed the heartbeat, the sound of the base's own nuclear power plant. For nearly a year, Vigilant Sentry built a comprehensive portrait of a bustling, highly active secret naval facility. They estimated a garrison of at least 500 personnel. They identified 3, possibly 4, Sierra-class submarines rotating in and out of the pens. They even began to piece together the likely course of the underwater tunnel, mapping subtle magnetic and gravitational anomalies that traced a path from the lake towards the White Sea. It was a masterpiece of technical intelligence. And then, in the late autumn of 1988, the heartbeat skipped. It was a junior analyst at the Underwater Sound Laboratory who first noticed it. The characteristic, 60 Hz hum of the base's power plant, a sound as reliable as a metronome, flickered. It wasn't a power outage, it was a change in load. A massive, sudden drop in energy consumption. The daily thermal spikes from submarine testing ceased. The regular acoustic signature of the water circulation pumps faded to a whisper. At first, the FROSTFALL team assumed it was a temporary shutdown for maintenance, perhaps a reactor scram, or a planned overhaul of the power grid. But days turned into weeks. The thermal signature of the lake, which had been a constant, pale gray ghost on the infrared scans, began to fade. Without the constant input of waste heat, the immense cold of the Arctic winter began to reassert its dominion. The ice over the lake grew thicker, its surface temperature plummeting until it was indistinguishable from the frozen land around it. The magnetometer readings told the most chilling tale. The sprawling, complex signature of the underground complex didn't disappear. That would have required the physical removal of thousands of tons of steel, an impossibility. Instead, it flattened. The sharp, dynamic peaks and valleys that indicated active machinery, moving parts, and electrical currents smoothed out into a dull, monolithic blob. The steel was still there, but it was inert, cold, silent. The acoustic buoys picked up a final, haunting symphony. The last recorded sounds were not of machines, but of industry in reverse, the massive, groaning sound of immense pressure doors sealing, the final, hydraulic hiss of systems being shut down, the gurgle of water displacing air. Then, nothing. Only the ancient sounds of the lake itself, the creak of ice and the cry of the wind. The submarines were gone. The personnel were gone. The base was a ghost. The silence was more terrifying than the activity had ever been. In the secure briefing rooms of Langley and Molesworth, a frantic, hushed debate began. What had happened? The most obvious conclusion was that the Soviets had discovered the breach in their security. A mole within NATO, a compromised signal, a telltale pattern in the surveillance that their own counterintelligence had finally detected. The base had been emergency evacuated and sealed, its strategic secret compromised. But that theory had holes. There was no evidence of a panic. The shutdown, while abrupt, appeared methodical, systematic. It was the closure of a facility, not the flight from one. Another, more unsettling theory gained traction. The base had served its purpose. It had been a proof of concept, or operational testbed for a new form of clandestine naval basing. And now, the technology and tactics perfected at Kepojavi were being deployed elsewhere. The base wasn't abandoned, it was obsolete. This line of thinking led to the darkest and most persistent suspicion among a small circle of veteran analysts, a theory that became known as the Russian doll hypothesis. The Soviet Union was a nation of layers, of secrets within secrets. If they had built one hidden base under a lake, what was to stop them from building another? A deeper one, a colder one, a facility designed from the ground up with the lessons of Kepojavi in mind, a base whose heat signature was perfectly managed, whose magnetic profile was masked by the natural geology, whose acoustic footprint was reduced to utter silence. The evidence was, by its very nature, non-existent. How do you find something designed to be unfindable? But the absence of evidence became its own kind of proof for the believers. The sheer, audacious scale of the original project demonstrated a willingness to attempt the impossible. The meticulous, silent closure of the base demonstrated a discipline and long-term planning that was chilling. They hadn't just cut their losses, they had cleaned the chessboard. The official NATO position, buried in a top-secret post-mortem report, was that Zavad Kepojavi had been decommissioned and secured. The file was closed. The satellites were retasked to other targets. The acoustic boys were left to their frozen vigil, their batteries eventually dying, their recordings lost to the eternal ice. But in the minds of those who had lived and breathed the hunt for the lake that glowed, the case was never truly closed. The Arctic wind that now swept unimpeded across the surface of Lake Kepojavi seemed to carry a whisper, a warning etched in frost. The Soviets had not just been building a base. They had been perfecting the art of disappearance. They had learned how to hide an entire navy beneath a sheet of ice. And if they could do it once, the most terrifying thought of all was that they had simply learned from their one, small mistake. They had gone to ground, burrowed deeper into the planet's cold, silent crust, building a new lair in the perpetual darkness, a place where no satellite could see, no magnetometer could sense, and no boy could hear. A base that had truly vanished, not because it was gone, but because it had learned to become a ghost.